She could have locked that sickroom door. Few people at court could have blamed Alexandra if she had refused. On the 6th of May, 1910, Buckingham Palace held its breath while King Edward VII lay gravely ill behind a closed door. The corridor outside carried disinfectant and the weight of waiting. Her black silk-covered heels struck the palace floor in dry beats. Then came the hand. A 65-year-old queen's hand, wrinkled, closing around a brass handle. She turned it and stepped back. That step created the space Alice Keppel could not claim for herself. For 12 years, Alice had shared the king's private life. Alexandra remained the wife history expected to endure. Yet this was not surrender. It was not polite forgiveness arranged for a private room. Alexandra had been kept outside decisions, pleasures, and closed circles of power. At that threshold, the dynasty waited on her choice. The mistress had known the king in health. The queen held the key at the end. Power was not the loudest voice. It was the hand deciding when a door opened and when it would close. To understand the weight of that turn, the story must move back 62 years. Before Alexandra held a palace door, she lived inside a title that brought little comfort. The Yellow Palace in Copenhagen sounded grand, yet its rooms knew shortage. Her family had an income of £800 a year. Cheap wax candles shook over needlework, while royal daughters cut patterns and repaired old dresses in a narrow attic. When the Nordic winter pressed through the walls, rank did not warm the room. Alexandra learned that a name could not feed anyone. Patience became survival. Material lack gave Alex something court training often crushed. She moved through that small household with open warmth, not strategy. Her hands crossed the worn piano keys with quick confidence, and her smile reached the large, bright eyes her family knew. She spoke 3 foreign languages, played music, and made people feel seen without performing rank. That quality mattered because Britain's royal house was living under public grief. To them, the Danish girl's presence looked like medicine and perhaps like use. Then a letter to London changed her life. Crown Princess Vicky, Queen Victoria's eldest daughter, described the 16-year-old Danish princess in decisive black ink. One phrase carried the verdict: "The sweetest creature I ever saw." The line sounded tender, but it also worked as an appraisal. Alex's beauty and clarity had entered a royal market, measured against bloodline, image, and public repair. A cold bargain was sealed in red wax. On the 10th of March, 1863, the 18-year-old Danish girl stepped toward the carriage. 3 days before the wedding, huge crowds packed the streets to see the Danish bride arrive in Britain. On March 10th, 1863, she stood inside St. George's Chapel, Windsor, under the full weight of royal ceremony. Silver antique moiré silk caught the light around her young body. Orange blossoms rested in her carefully arranged hair. At 18, Alexandra was being offered to Britain as brightness itself. The cheers sounded like welcome. They also fixed her inside a perfect shape. St. George's Chapel did not feel like a theater for love. It carried the weight of mourning dressed as ceremony. High above the wedding floor, Queen Victoria sat apart in black. She refused the lower hall. Grief for Prince Albert still governed her public body. Her face looked down from the dim gallery with the authority of a ruler who would not soften the room. Alexandra stood beneath that shadow. The bride was expected to bring light into a house that still answered to loss. The colder warning came not from the chapel, but from the man she was marrying. Bertie already carried a reputation for appetite, distraction, and life outside restraint. Alexandra had stepped into Britain as a bright answer, without knowing the machine had already claimed her. Its first demand would be her body. / royal marriage did not ask Alexandra for romance. It demanded heirs, and it demanded them fast. Between 1864 and 1871, she gave birth to 6 children. The first, Albert Victor, known in the family as Eddie, arrived 2 months early. His cry was thin, broken by pauses, while doctors watched a red, wrinkled infant under thick wool blankets. He weighed less than 4 pounds. Each birth tied her body tighter to Britain's succession. Youth became service. The palace could praise her grace in public while counting the children that proved her value. Inside Marlborough House, the nursery became the one room where duty changed shape. Alexandra could remove the heavy silk dress, roll back her sleeves, and place her bare hands into warm water. She washed the children herself instead of surrendering every gesture to nurses. Her voice softened around the name she chose for them to use. Mother, dear. That was not a public role. That was a private hold on meaning. In those small bodies, she found the part of royal life that still answered to touch. While Alexandra built that family from exhaustion and care, Bertie kept moving elsewhere. At dusk, the head of the family table could sit empty. Far from that silence, glass struck glass at hunting parties, gambling rooms, and dinners built around pleasure. His absences were not accidents of schedule. They showed what domestic life failed to offer him. One partner gave her body to preserve the line. The other used rank to widen his freedom. The contrast was the marriage in miniature. Her children anchored her. His world kept opening outward. Alexandra had already given more than the empire could fairly ask. Yet the next blow would fall on the same fragile body. In 1867, death came near Marlborough House, carrying a fever that burned through bone. Long before the empire copied Alexandra's style, it copied a concealment. People began to notice the bands of pearl and diamond wrapped high against her throat. The jewels rose almost to her chin, cold and ordered in layers. Beneath them sat a small physical scar left from childhood surgery on delicate skin. Alexandra understood the terms of public life. Millions could study her face, dress, and posture. Luxury became a way to guide their eyes away from the mark. Because she was Alexandra, the trick became fashion. Across Britain, aristocratic women with unmarked throats hurried to fasten rows of jewels beneath their chins. They tightened collars before mirrors, accepting discomfort for the chance to resemble the Princess of Wales. The imitation looked flattering from outside. Its irony was sharper than any jewel. A private cover for a physical scar became a social command. The crowd copied the surface, while the reason underneath remained untouched. No one asked what it had hidden. That choker did more than hide skin. It trained Alexandra in the public use of splendor. Before facing the room, she could fasten the final diamond clasp and draw one measured breath. In the mirror, her quiet eyes met a version of herself built for inspection. Personal hurt had been taken from her and sold back as taste. The lesson was plain. Pearls could make a scar disappear. But when a damaged body could not be covered so neatly, society would need a harsher way to call it beautiful. In the winter of 1867, rheumatic fever struck Alexandra during the final weeks of pregnancy. It went for the joints. At the moment, her body was already carrying another royal demand. When labor came, doctors feared the risk of chloroform against the fever. So she had to remain conscious through the birth of Princess Louise. Sweat covered her face. Her hands gripped the brass bed frame until the skin turned pale. The pain came from illness and childbirth at once. No curtain, title, or protocol could soften the physical fact. Royal duty left her awake for every minute of it. The child lived. Alexandra lived. Yet the illness left a sentence in her right leg. The old, easy rhythm did not return. Her right foot dragged across red carpet, heavier than the left. Her hip tilted with each step. At moments, she needed the arm of a servant to steady herself without drawing the room toward it. The court had been trained to read the smallest flaw in a royal body. Now a woman sold to Britain, as Grace had to cross public rooms with a limp she could not hide. It followed her for life. Then admiration turned into something colder. London women with healthy legs began copying what illness had done to her. Dressmakers weighted one side of gowns with lead so the fabric pulled the body into an uneven walk. Jeweled canes appeared on dance floors, carried by women who did not need them. The Alexandra limp became a fashion signal. Respect had crossed into appetite. Society could turn her disability into a game, then call the imitation elegance. She kept walking through the praise. The damage had reached her legs, but fate was not finished. Around her, sound would begin to dim. By the years after 1867, Alexandra's hearing problems had become harder to ignore. Later accounts often connect them with progressive deafness, sometimes described as otosclerosis. The inherited condition moved through the bones of hearing, turning royal sound into distance. Music at dinner, crystal against crystal, and voices around polished tables no longer reached her in clean shape. They thinned into a dull pressure inside the ear. The higher she stood in the empire, the farther conversation moved from her. Political remarks, jokes, warnings, and private meanings passed across rooms she had to occupy without full access. Rank placed her at the center. Deafness pushed her to the edge. Alexandra could not ask the court to stop and rearrange itself around her. So she learned survival by performance. At large dinners, her eyes moved from mouth to mouth, catching shapes before words disappeared. She chose seats where faces stayed visible. The smile came at the expected moment. The nod followed, as though meaning had landed. Yet often the person opposite had spoken into silence. Every meal required calculation, timing, and restraint. Deafness did not remove her from display. It made display harder, because she had to appear present while being kept outside the room. That silence exposed two different royal instincts. Queen Victoria, severe in so many ways, learned the manual alphabet to speak with her daughter-in-law. Her old hands formed letters slowly, one by one, making private contact where speech failed. Bertie did not make the same effort. Later accounts describe impatience, then withdrawal, as he turned toward livelier rooms and easier voices. The contrast was plain. The mother-in-law tried to cross the barrier. The husband let it stand. Once that wall of sound was built, Bertie found other conversations waiting beyond it. After the wall of silence rose around Alexandra, Bertie filled his rooms with livelier voices. The women who entered his life did not hide like figures in a back corridor. Lily Langtry crossed ballrooms under crystal light, an actress carrying beauty as social currency. Jenny Jerome laughed with sharp assurance among people trained to notice every glance. Daisy Warwick appeared at estate weekends with the confidence of someone who understood the rules. These women were not kept outside polite society. They moved through the same halls, dinners, and country gatherings where Alexandra was expected to sit with composure. Bertie's relationships outside marriage were not treated as a buried secret. They became part of the royal atmosphere. Victorian aristocratic marriage had its own cold arithmetic. A wife protected lineage, property, and public order. A powerful husband's pleasures were often managed as a separate matter, provided the surface remained polished. Seating plans could be adjusted with quiet skill. A smile across a table could carry more permission than a written note. Guests looked away, then looked back at the right time. The table itself became an alibi. Such discretion was called manners, but it did the work of consent. The arrangement did not erase humiliation. It only made complaint more dangerous. Alexandra was forced to protect the dignity of a household that had already made room for her insult. Alexandra knew enough. Her answer was not a scene, and not a public wound offered for gossip. She chose calm as discipline. When she passed the women linked to Bertie, she could nod, smile, and leave no visible crack in her face. That restraint was not weakness. By refusing to perform injury for the room, she denied society the spectacle it knew how to consume. Her silence held the moral ground because no one could turn it into entertainment. Over time, that mask became part of her body. It was survival by control, not surrender. Later generations would look back and compare her to Diana. The shape seems tempting. The truth moved on another track. Royal history often repeats its injuries with different tools. Alexandra's black and white smile can seem to flicker beside the later color age of televised confession. Both women stood beside a prince whose private life became public pressure. Both faced a wife's oldest humiliation, being expected to preserve the institution while another woman was protected by it. That likeness matters, but it can also mislead. Diana lived in a century with cameras, interviews, newspapers hungry for rupture, and a public trained to read pain as testimony. Alexandra lived under Victorian rules, where royal divorce in the 19th century carried the weight of social execution. For her, escape had no clean door. Alexandra did not possess the modern weapon of exposure. No tape recorder waited in an empty room. No television lens offered a way to turn private injury into public evidence. At most, anger could become handwriting, then torn paper, then ash in the fire. The old world knew how to crush resistance through manners, duty, and silence. So she survived by mastering silence first. She made stillness look like dignity. Unable to find warmth in her husband, she poured what remained into the frail child she called Eddie. Albert Victor, known as Eddie, entered the world already marked by frailty. Born early, he never seemed to carry the easy strength expected from a future prince. In the cold light of January, Alexandra held his small, shaking body close while winter pressed against the castle windows. The servants and doctors could measure his weakness, but she answered with grip, not distance. She would not let the fragile life be treated as another nursery problem. From that beginning, protection became the language between mother and son. Eddie was not only her child, he was the life she refused to surrender. As Eddie grew, the court began reading him with less mercy. The royal household compared children as though succession were a table of measurements. Queen Victoria's diary judged him with cutting words, calling him abnormally dormant. Other descriptions made the verdict harsher: sluggish, slow, less alert beside his younger brother George. The system wanted brightness, discipline, and promise. Eddie gave them hesitation. In a family built around inheritance, weakness became a political defect. The boy was treated less like a child with limits and more like a flawed answer to the throne's demands. To Alexandra, that judgment made him dearer. She could walk beside Eddie on stone steps, holding his hand at his pace, placing herself between him and the court's sharp looks. Other people saw an inconvenience. She saw the fragile life that had survived because someone refused to loosen her hold. Her love carried the force of compensation and perhaps defiance. Eddie did not betray her, demand performance, or ask her to hide frailty. Around him, she did not need the mask. He became her truest country. Then in 1892, 6 weeks before his wedding, a brutal epidemic began moving across Europe. The wedding planned for late February was ended by influenza before it could become a ceremony. In January 1892, Eddie was 28, still the son Alexandra had guarded since his weak birth. At Sandringham, the illness moved faster than preparation or rank. His coughing tightened inside his failing lungs, each breath broken by effort. The room blurred around the bed as family members watched without language that could change anything. On January 14, 1892, Eddie's breathing stopped at Sandringham. The future heir was gone inside a country house built for royal continuity. Alexandra had spent 28 years holding that fragile life against cold rooms, doctors, and judgment. Influenza took what protection could no longer defend. The loss did not only remove a son from the succession, it erased the private place where she had been allowed to love without performance. Britain answered with public mourning, and the royal script closed around her again. The memorial in St. George's Chapel would fix Eddie in black and white marble. His eyes were closed. His face was calm, as though sleep had replaced a life. Alexandra stood in mourning dress, black from veil to hem, before a nation trained to read royal posture. No cry was offered to the crowd. No public tear was allowed to become the story. The mother who had guarded Eddie from weakness now had to guard the monarchy from the sight of any loss of command. That restraint was not emptiness. It was the old discipline forced back onto a new wound. The dynasty required dignity, even when dignity meant standing still beside a son carved in stone. Public grief could be arranged, printed, and remembered. Her part was to survive the arrangement without breaking its surface. When Eddie's bedroom door at Sandringham closed, Alexandra claimed the one room no one else could govern. The room was left as he had known it. A shaving brush gathered a gray film of dust on the marble table. The washbowl dried until a pale mineral ring marked the place where water had been. Curtains kept the folds of that January morning. Nothing was to be moved. For 33 years, the order held. This was not only mourning carried past reason. It was control, claimed in the one space still answerable to her. She could not control her husband's wandering life. She could not restore her damaged leg. She could not bargain with influenza. But in Eddie's room, time obeyed. She locked herself to the dead through objects, while her husband kept searching for life in another woman's arms. In 1898, that woman would appear. By 1898, Bertie was 56, heavier, quicker to irritation, and long practiced in entitlement. Then Alice Keppel entered his circle at 29. She was married, polished, and alert to the uses of beauty. Her eyes carried calculation without seeming hard. Her smile could soften a room before anyone named the bargain. Alice understood rank as a staircase. She brought charm, but also a mind trained for advantage. The meeting reshaped Bertie's remaining years because she was not only young, she knew how power liked to be handled. And Bertie, aging and restless, followed her. Alice was different from the actresses and society beauties who had passed through Bertie's life before her. She could stand among ministers in a drawing room and read the temperature of the conversation. A small remark from her could ease one of Bertie's bursts of anger. A well-timed phrase could make a quarrel lose its edge. She gave him what Alexandra's deafness had made harder. She listened sharply. She calmed him in public. She turned private access into public influence. In that arrangement, the bedroom was not separate from power. It became another corridor of government. That was why Alice did not pass like a season. She settled into the marriage as a role replacement, steady enough to change the air around Alexandra. At weekend estates, her hand could pour tea for Bertie with the ease of a hostess, while aristocrats watched and understood the message. She did not need a crown to occupy space. Her presence lasted 12 years, long enough to take the companionship that age might have returned to husband and wife. Alice Keppel became a direct blade in the marriage. Alexandra's answer would be colder than accusation, and the empire would feel it. Alexandra did not scream at Alice Keppel in public. She did not grant the court the comfort of a jealous scene. When Bertie sent jewels, Alice sometimes helped choose them, and Alexandra accepted the boxes. She could open them with calm hands, lift the stones from velvet, and wear what the other woman had selected. A cold thank you kept the surface intact. It was not forgiveness. It was the price of protecting royal dignity from gossip. That restraint has often been called tolerance, yet the mechanism was harder than kindness. In the same drawing rooms, Alexandra could let her steady eyes pass over Alice without pause. Perfect manners turned the most powerful mistress into furniture. By refusing open conflict, she kept the moral height. Alice could be useful, desired, and welcomed, but never legitimate. Alexandra allowed her to exist inside the room, then fixed her there as a shadow beneath the wife's rank. This was strategic composure, not defeat. In one harsher sense, Alice also became a physical reprieve. After 6 births in 7 years, Alexandra knew what the marriage had taken from her body. At night, the brass latch on her bedroom door could fall into place. It separated her from Bertie's demands without breaking royal rules. The mistress carried part of the burden the wife no longer wished to carry. That was not liberation. It was survival inside a gilded cage. Alexandra had learned the game in darkness. Next, the crown would pull her into light. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, a reign of 63 years ended. For Alexandra, it also ended 38 years of waiting under her mother-in-law's shadow. The title she had approached as an 18-year-old bride finally reached her at 56. A brilliant crown was lowered onto hair already marked with silver. The empire could now call her queen consort. Yet the victory arrived late, after youth had been spent in obedience, patience, and careful silence. At Westminster Abbey, the coronation dressed that delay as grandeur. Gold silk covered Alexandra's thin frame, embroidered with the sacred symbols of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The robe trailed across cold stone steps, turning her body into a national image. From below, she could seem almost untouchable, but ritual visibility was not political command. The crown gave her a place in public worship, not a voice in government. The garment looked like power. It also hid how little power had been given. Even that crown could not remove the enemy in the shadows from her husband's world. Alice Keppel remained within the Edwardian court, confident enough to be seen where rank gathered. Even after Edward became king, Alice remained close enough to the court for her presence to sting. She could look down toward the new queen with the ease of someone protected by access. Alexandra had the throne, but not the heart beside it. Her voice had been taken inside her own palace, so she carried the wound outward toward other broken souls. Away from diplomatic dinners, Alexandra found steadier ground in London's hospitals. Her familiar limp moved slowly between dim beds, past metal frames, and tired faces. The royal hand did not hover above suffering. It reached down, closing around the rough, weakened fingers of a gravely ill patient. The visits were not empty theater. Pain had already trained her body, and that training made comfort feel earned. Her charity then grew beyond visits. Through the Imperial Military Nursing Service and Alexandra Rose Day, she turned sympathy into public machinery. Paper roses became small tokens of survival. She pinned them onto the coats of injured soldiers, men missing limbs or strength, and met their eyes without speeches. Illness was not abstract to her. Tenderness came from inside the bone, not from duty. That was why ordinary people reached for her carriage as it passed through fog. Poor crowds pressed into the street, waving paper roses and calling for the deaf queen, who had not kept herself above them. They sensed warmth beneath the ceremony, something the court had failed to give back to her. Millions could love her, yet love from the street could not stop the darkest hour moving toward the crown. By May 1910, Edward was 68 and fighting bronchitis with the stubborn vanity that had defined him. The cough tore through his chest, rough enough to bend the room toward him. Fainting spells left his face gray and drained. Yet he still clung to the arm of a chair and growled that he would work to the end. Weakness had no place in his idea of kingship. He ordered the body to serve until it could no longer obey him. The urgent telegram reached Alexandra while she was in Corfu, visiting her brother. She left at once, racing back toward London through stations, sea air, and night. On the express train, her anxious face stayed fixed toward the glass as the dark tore past. On May 5th, 1910, she pushed back through Buckingham Palace. Edward had one day left. Her return was not a performance of grief. It was the duty of a queen taking her place beside a dying husband in quiet authority. In the sick room, medicine soured the air. Alexandra sat near the bed, still enough to change the room without raising her voice. Her calm eyes moved over doctors, courtiers, and officials who did not know where to stand. No wail came from her. No public collapse disturbed the palace script. As queen consort, she had every right to bar any visitor from the king's final hours. At the moment of greatest control, she made a choice that shook court memory and changed the room forever. The order reached Alice Keppel at Portman Square, and the woman in the shadows moved toward Buckingham Palace. Outside her own drawing room, charm no longer protected her. Doctors, courtiers, and servants formed two silent lines as she passed through the dim corridors. Faces lowered. Bodies moved aside. Later accounts place Alexandra at the center of the decision, whatever Edward may have wished. Alice entered that sick room with no formal right. She entered because the lawful queen allowed it. For that moment, the mistress and the court moved under one wife's consent. The threshold made the arrangement visible. Inside the royal sick room, the two women now shared the same air. Alice stepped closer, careful and shaken, then took Edward's cold hand between her own. She murmured private words shaped by 12 hidden years. The wife stood back and watched the mistress receive those failing breaths. That permission was not painless nobility. It was a sentence Alexandra imposed upon herself. She allowed the scene to happen, then bore witness to every second of it. The door had opened by her will alone. Many later writers called the gesture mercy, but mercy does not explain the full shape of it. Alexandra's eyes stayed fixed on Alice's trembling shoulder beside the bed. She did not move, and no one in the room mistook who held control. Alice could stay only as long as Alexandra allowed. Every whispered word and every touch at that bedside existed under Alexandra's permission. It was permission, not freedom. Alice was about to mistake it for belonging. For 12 years, Alice Keppel had been famous for polished composure. In drawing rooms, she could smile through tension and make scandal look like manners. But beside Edward's sickbed, that discipline cracked. Her sobs broke the order Alexandra had allowed. She sank against the mattress, clutching at the sheets while panic took over. In a private house, such grief might have been human. In a royal sick room, before the lawful queen, it became a breach. Alexandra did not shout. She did not need accusation, insult, or a public contest for the man on the bed. Her eyes moved from Edward's gray face to the woman collapsing beside him. Then she turned toward the physician in charge. "See that she is taken out." The words landed harder because they were so plain. They stripped Alice of every borrowed privilege at once. No charm could protect her now. No old arrangement could pretend she belonged there anymore. Alexandra had opened the door. Now she closed it. The command reminded everyone present what rank still meant. This was her chamber, her husband, and her final line. Visiting time was over. Alice was taken from the bedside, no longer mistress of anything that mattered there. Hands lifted her away, while her crying followed the movement toward the door. The oak panels closed with hard finality, pushing her voice back into the corridor. What had lasted 12 years ended in a few steps. The woman who had poured tea like a hostess and soothed tempers like a counselor was now only an unwanted presence. Alexandra did not chase her. She did not plead for recognition. She let others carry out the order. When the door shut, silence returned around the bed. The queen remained with the man who had betrayed her for a lifetime as darkness gathered over him. At 11:45 at night on May 6th, 1910, Edward VII stopped breathing. The sick room held its silence after the last movement left his chest. Alexandra's old veined hand moved toward the silk coverlet. She drew it slowly across the gray face of the king, her clouded eyes giving the room no public tear. The most powerful man in the empire had fallen still. In that instant, the ritual duty of being his wife ended. Then, according to later accounts, the 65-year-old widow gave the room a sentence no official announcement could contain. Her mouth moved slowly, and the words came out dry. "Now at least I know where he is." The line may have survived through palace memory, not a formal record, but its force lies there. It was not only mourning. It was the distilled bitterness of a woman who had spent a marriage inside uncertainty. She never fully knew which room, which bed, or which loyalty had claimed him next. For 47 years, Alexandra had lived with absence as a pattern. A carriage gone too long, a chair empty at dinner, a name never spoken, yet understood by every servant in the hall. Edward's death removed the man, but also ended the uncertainty that had followed him through their life. The bitter release came from the fact that the grave could keep him where marriage never had. The king was dead. The power of his clouded widow had only begun. Unlike crown property, Sandringham was private. Edward's will gave Alexandra a lifetime interest in the estate, and that was enough to keep the big house under her control. Sunlight cut across the long rooms and corridors. Servants kept polishing tiles, carrying coal, and following orders from an old deaf widow. Every corridor proved a legal fact. This fortress was hers. After decades of being displaced in marriage, Alexandra used ownership as a late form of command. Instead of withdrawing and handing the great house to George V, she stayed. The new king, his wife, and their 7 children had to live inside York Cottage. It was the smaller hunting lodge tucked within his mother's estate. Its rooms were cramped, dim, and awkward for a reigning family. Outsiders could call Alexandra selfish or stubborn, yet the choice carried another meaning. She refused to be moved aside again. The woman who had surrendered youth, body, and silence would not surrender the ground beneath her feet. Sandringham became her private throne, but victory sounded hollow inside its corridors. Alexandra's uneven steps moved along long, empty passages, the limp arriving before she did. Behind her, Princess Victoria often followed like a pale shadow, the daughter caught inside the widow's orbit. Servants obeyed. Doors opened. Meals appeared on schedule. Still, the estate felt less like reward than enclosure. She had won the largest house and found herself aging inside it. Outside, Europe kept turning, and exiles would soon come knocking. The First World War did not merely scar Alexandra's widowhood. It burned through the royal order that once made her family useful. Newspapers arrived with gray headlines. Germany broken, Austria, Hungary collapsing, Russia torn open by revolution. Nicholas II and his family lost their lives in the Ipatiev basement, far from drawing rooms that had linked dynasties by marriage. The Danish web of crowns, cousins, and alliances had been cut apart by artillery and revolt. Old names no longer commanded the map. In 1919, HMS Marlborough moved through the Black Sea, carrying another ruin of that vanished order. The former Empress Maria Feodorovna was Alexandra's sister, born Dagmar, once seated near the center of Imperial Russia. Now she came ashore worn down by flight, trembling in the mist with the loss of family behind her. The contrast was brutal. The Danish girls who had climbed into Europe's highest houses now faced the wreckage of those houses. One had lost family to revolution. One had lost a life to lies. At Sandringham, the sisters sat across from each other as survivors of an age burned behind them. The fire cracked in the grate. Their spotted hands held tight while they spoke of a cramped attic, cheap candles, and Danish winters that once felt poor but safe. Crowns, empires, Grand marriages and diplomatic bloodlines had turned to ash. What remained was memory, the warm poverty they had left behind and could never recover. Their marriages had served dynasties. When those dynasties broke, the women were left to carry the cost. In her final years, Alexandra's hearing sank into almost total silence, and memory began to loosen its hold. At Sandringham, the 80-year-old widow could sit by the window and look across lawns buried under white snow. Her eyes drifted over the frozen grass as though time had moved somewhere beyond reach. The sounds of court, betrayal, and old obligation no longer pressed on her in the same way. Deafness had once isolated her. Now, joined to fading memory, it seemed almost merciful. It spared her from the full weight of injuries carried across 60 years of royal life. Yet one command stayed firm when other things slipped. At the end of a dim corridor, the brass lock on Eddie's room remained cold and shut. For 33 years, no servant had been allowed to disturb the air inside. Dust could gather. Curtains could hold their old folds. The silence could thicken around the objects left behind. That room was the last territory Alexandra still governed without argument. Time had taken her husband, her son, her hearing, and much of her certainty. But no one could force that door open while she still breathed. On the 20th of November, 1925, a heart attack ended Alexandra's life. It came 11 days before her 81st birthday. The oak coffin lid lowered into the dark vault at St. George's Chapel, placing her beside Edward for the last royal silence. Then Sandringham changed at once. A hammer struck the lock on Eddie's room, and light entered a space frozen for a third of a century. The washstand, curtains, and dust no longer answered to her will. The living cleared away 33 years of guarded grief. Alexandra carried the locked rooms and black secrets with her into the cold ground. For 47 years, Alexandra watched her husband enter other rooms, other households, and other loyalties. She learned that a queen could lose a marriage and still keep command of the threshold. In 1910, the sick room returned the whole story to one brass handle. It turned. Alice entered by permission. Then the latch clicked again, and her crying stayed outside. Alexandra did not need a public storm to reclaim the room. She opened the door because power allowed it. She closed it because power was hers. That was her victory: silence, endurance, and the final right to shut.